Our guests today are Blair Jones, a managing director of Semler Brossy in New York City, and Mike Kesner, a partner of Pay Governance in Chicago. Two of my favorite people. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. So Blair and Mike, I feel like we're getting the band back together. I'm so excited to be with you and talking about a topic I think we might have done a webcast on this the year before I left my last job, but it's such a hot topic. The metrics you might use in an incentive pay for ESG. ESG is such a hot topic. Investors are keenly interested in it, and they are interested, I believe, as we're going to hear, in how it's being used as a way to guide executive pay. So Blair, the first question is, where do you even start with this? I know it's hard for companies to even start with their sustainability report. How about in the incentive pay area? Is there reliable data, and are we in a position to have ESG incentive metrics?
Well, it's a good question. And the truth of the matter is you start with business strategy, right? Because you want to, even with ESG, you want to make sure that you're choosing metrics that ultimately are aligned with your strategy. So if you're a CPG company, things like sustainable sourcing, things like sustainable packaging become pretty important. If you're in the energy industry, things like carbon footprint are important. And for all companies at some level, D&I is important. So you start with the business. Now the data question is, I think, what makes this hard, and measuring it right is really what makes this challenging. So at one level, you want to walk before you run. So for many companies right now, incentives are not the place they should start. They should start by making sure they can actually measure these things reliably. And there are external standards out there. There's GRI, there's SASB, there's now the new World Economic Forum principles that have come out, but that in itself makes things confusing. So what you want to do is make sure that you're getting to a reliable measure that is meaningful to your business, that you can then demonstrate makes a difference for shareholders at the end of the day.
And Blair, I'd also add too, it's part of it is, are some of these metrics baked into the culture yet? Are they part of how you operate the business? Yes, part of strategy. Is it something that's really permeating the whole organization as well? Because it's hard to start measuring and creating incentives on something that's not well understood or the culture's not steeped in those types of metrics, or the business hasn't been focusing on it. Although
you're absolutely
some would argue,
right.
and some would argue, as you say, unless you measure it, people won't manage it. So maybe we should start measuring it. But really, that doesn't usually work. Sometimes compensation is viewed as the strategy, and that's not the case. It's really the reverse. It's compensation supports the strategy, supports the culture, and what the company's trying to do. So putting it in an incentive plan won't magically change behavior if the company's not ready to pick up on the metrics.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Mike, because at the end of the day, you want this to be something that the CEO and the leadership team are talking about, that are part of the scorecard that you're looking at all the time. And if they aren't there, it is hard for compensation to follow. I think it's probably inevitable, and more inevitable than it's ever been, that it's going to be in compensation, because investors are very interested in it. Companies are picking up on the cues and are increasing the rigor and the quality of the measures they're looking at in their CSR reports. So the compensation plan does seem like the holy grail, but you certainly don't want to be premature in putting in the compensation plan, because you've got limited real estate there. And if you get it wrong, then it's hard to fix and hard to build credibility going forward.
And Mike, am I correct in that investors are looking for this kind of thing?
Absolutely. I know Pension Investments had an article that said that worldwide there's $43 billion of money tied towards socially responsible investing, which would include ESG type metrics. And in the US, it was over $13 billion of funds specially designed to focus in this area. Another article I saw, which was really fascinating, is the fact that baby boomers will be leaving over $24 trillion to millennial generation. And the millennial generation is much more interested in working for companies that are focused on ESG, as well as investing in companies that are focusing on ESG. So as shareholders and future shareholders are very much interested in, the investment community has definitely stepped up with specialty funds that address this need. And that's not to say that all companies shouldn't be focused on it, but there's a lot of targeting of socially responsible investments going on right now. Another thing that I saw too is Blair, ISS did a survey, and this was just on diversity and inclusion, and this was their recent policy survey, and of the investors that responded, 78% said they would support proxy proposals that wanted more disclosure on D&I, or where you set targets on diversity within an organization. So it's just another sign that there's a lot of interest across a wide range of investors in ESG type metrics. Blair.
And Mike, I'm sure you're finding the same thing, but all of my clients who are going out and doing shareholder outreach, this is the topic that leads. So it used to be that we were going out and talking about compensation issues, and certainly companies are still talking about compensation issues and are talking about compensation problems and talking about say on pay if they've had a say on pay issue. But the lead for all of these shareholder outreach discussions seems to be COVID, and then involving ESG metrics.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's such a relief to talk about ESG in addition to just all the COVID-related compensation issues that actually, you're right, that those have been the two topics that have taken up the most attention this year.
Yeah, so whether it's about incentives or not, you just see the inevitability of this coming and eventually making its way into incentives.
And then Blair, drilling down into the actual nuts and bolts of how this gets put together, are there different parties inside the company that get involved in metrics, ESG metrics? Is it still the HR department, or do they have to draw in new resources to provide additional expertise?
So a lot of the parties are the same, Brock. I mean, again, you're going to start with the strategy. So that's going to be the full leadership team and your strategy group working on that. But more specifically on the metrics, most companies have a dedicated CSR, or corporate social responsibility function right now. And those individuals are getting very closely involved in choosing the metrics that make sense to be in an incentive compensation program. Now, then you need your finance people involved as well to make sure you can demonstrate that that metric can create value for shareholders, and that you can actually analytically show that and communicate that. And then, of course, legal would want to get involved to make sure that you do everything from a compliance standpoint. But it's really HR and the corporate social responsibility function now working together as the leads on the right metrics, and then using the other partners to round out the actual design.
In a lot of cases, too, they'll bring in, for example, with safety, we used to bring in the safety experts to help with some of the metrics, and the same thing.
And then, Mike, what about the time frame? Is this a multi-year process? I guess it depends where a company is in terms of their strategy, but overall, is it more complex than sort of what had become, I guess, rote sort of incentive?
Well, it's funny. There was an article recently where a CEO said that he was getting very frustrated with his management team, and 15% of incentives were going to be based on improved diversity. So snap of the fingers, and it became part of an incentive plan. I have a client I'm working with where we're on a 1-year journey. They get very high marks right now on ESG, and it's built into the culture, but they want to make sure that they look at this carefully, because as we discussed, if they pick some sort of diversity goal, does that mean that employee engagement isn't important? Part of the problem is there's so many important metrics. Do we use a scorecard? Do we pick one metric? If one metric, is it to the exclusion of something else that's important? So they're going to take it won't take a whole year, but they're going to take a look at, as Blair said, what fits the strategy, what have they already committed to, because they've already made some commitments on the percentage of management that will be women. And so now they want to build on that and try to make sure that it all hangs together. And it's something that's measurable. And also the question, whether it should be short-term or long-term incentive plan also adds some of the complexity to the design, since setting goals for 3 years is a little trickier than setting a 1-year goal, for example. So we're going to take some time. So I think, in between the 15 seconds it took one CEO to 1 year, there's probably a lot in between. But I think a lot of companies are taking a thoughtful approach to this, and we do expect there will be an increase in the use of these metrics. And you also get mixed signals from the proxy advisory firms. I remember, I think Glass Lewis came out during the middle of the year and said maybe it's not a good time to shift off of financial goals right now because of COVID. And I think ISS has generally taken a view 20-30% on non-financial is okay, as long as you don't use that to ratchet up payments in a bad financial year. So, again, there's a lot to consider in addition to shareholder engagement and getting their feedback. So it takes some time.
And it may be a situation where it's a little bit of walk before you run. In the sense of when we've looked at what people are doing currently, a lot of this is measured qualitatively. And, you can question how well those qualitative assessments are done. But to the extent you look at a scorecard of a variety of metrics and you use it perhaps as a modifier, or you use it as part of the individual adjustment, then you can work your way to that 20 or 25%. To your point, Mike, as you understand the measures better. Because one of the things I'm finding with my clients is the things that are easy to measure are not always the best measures. So you can measure, for instance, going back to diversity and inclusion, the representation numbers, but you don't know whether that's really changed the inclusion or, whether it's really changed how things are working. A lot of companies with very good representation numbers, as they start to look at their processes deeper in the organization, are finding themselves coming up short. And so really thinking about what needs to move rather than the easiest measure becomes a pretty important decision as well.
Walk before you run. Some companies are actually just looking at the inputs of setting up structures and programs and education, and they're really in the early stages. So they're measuring some of the activities that are occurring as opposed to the output, which would be the actual improvements and getting a little more defined in terms of what the goals should be. So it's qualitative, but it's more input-based than output-based, because some of these things will take, diversity and inclusion is probably the best example, is probably a long time horizon for real change, for significant change. That is not something that will happen in 1, 2, even 3 years.
No question. And I think as we think about investors, there are some who feel like it's urgent for it to be in the incentive program, but there are an equal number who are saying, just measure it and communicate to us where you are on the journey. Now, I think that will change, but right now there is openness to take the time to get the measures right.
Yeah, and I think the SEC has helped with their new disclosure and, basically it's principles based, but basically requiring that companies disclose significant human resource policies and practices. I think companies have been a little shy to be disclosing some of those things, and hopefully we'll see a market improvement in that level of disclosure beyond how many employees we have. And if you're lucky, you might get the geography they're located in. A lot of CSR scorecards do have the diversity data, but not much in terms of the programs and policies that are driving the human resource policies.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We should get a lot of feedback from those disclosures about what investors are looking for. And I think that'll be informative to companies as they try to marry what they're trying to do as a business with what's expected.
And this is what the lawyers are very involved in those particular disclosures right now, discussing them, since those are now live and required.
So Blair, do you have a sense if it's, are companies looking more short term or longer term in terms of their goals and their metrics?
Well, I think in the spirit of walk before you run, companies have been more inclined to put things in the short term, more milestone oriented or more scorecard oriented. That said, if you look at Europe as an example, you see Shell Oil, who's put their net carbon footprint into their long-term incentive plan for the first time. You see Danone, who has measures of employee sustainability and also climate impact in their long-term program. I do have some retail clients who have started to put sourcing goals in their long-term program. Ultimately, these are long-term metrics. The trick with a long-term plan, of course, is that you need them to be objective. So I think it takes even more rigor around making sure that you've got an objective measure and that it can be consistently looked at over time, and that it isn't something that's going to be impacted by business restructurings and that kind of thing, so that you can get a good track record moving forward.
Or you make a really good point. I've always said this about long-term plans, that you need them to be objective. And the problem, if it's qualitative in a long-term plan, is what happened the last quarter or year is going to dominate the evaluation as opposed to the full 3 years. Where if it's quantitative, it's calculated and there's not as much discretion. But I found that when we've had qualitative or judgment at the back end of a long-term plan, it's like the last 3 months, not the full 36, that seemed to get weighted the most. Maybe the result was okay, but I was uncomfortable with that. And in an annual plan, it's much easier to use qualitative. Even if the last 3 months count the most, at least it's 3 within the last 12 and not 3 after 36 months. And that means you got to really focus on something that's kind of a hard score, whether it's a diversity goal or it's a greenhouse gas reduction goal. That's where I think ultimately we may head, Brock, because truly, I said this before, I think this is a long-term type metric more than an annual. The annual to get to having the long-term results you want, but ultimately measuring it over the longer term is what I think we'll eventually get to. Right now, it's like 100 to 1 of annual versus long-term. Very few companies have it in their long-term plan. Almost all companies that have introduced this do it as part of the annual plan or the executive's annual evaluation. Very, very few have it in their long-term plan. I think Semler Brossy did a study on this of the Fortune 200, and it was like, I don't know, maybe 4 companies.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
The
vast majority have it in the short-term incentive plan. I mean, it will be interesting to see how this ultimately works out. There are some companies who have it in both. In the annual plan, I think the best it can do right now is be a signaling impact. In the long-term plan, it'll be an actual goal. So.
And then, Mike, what about the degree of emphasis, the weighting of ESG, measured metrics?
Most of these metrics, it's anywhere from 5 to 30%. When you get up in the 15, 20, 30%, it's usually part of a basket of measures. So it's a scorecard of several ESG metrics that may be listed out that are not weighted, maybe not have specific goals. And then when you have, like I have a client that has food safety and employee safety, and those are each measured, those are each 10%. So what I found is that the more weighting it seems, the more it's the basket of measures, more qualitative than the quantitative, but it ranges in between 5 and 30. My general view is if it's less than 20%, it doesn't get quite the impact you want. In an annual plan and a long-term plan, 10%, 20% might be a lot because long-term incentives for executives in particular are so much more valuable than the annual plan, sometimes 2, 4, 5 times more. So you could have a smaller percentage. But when I see companies start weighting things 5%, it's like, is that really going to move the needle? Somebody's got a 40% target bonus. That's 2% of their salary. I'm sure they want it, but is it going to change behavior? And I worry that it also sends the wrong message. Well, it's on the scorecard, but it's really not that important. So, I just would caution companies of if we have weighted measures, not to underweight it. And again, for the ones that are more highly weighted, it seems like it's more a basket, which probably makes sense right now where we are in this whole cycle.
No question at all. And I think at the end of the day, as you look at the types of metrics people are using, as we get to metrics that are more contemporary, strategic in nature, we will be able to quantify their meaning, and then you're more comfortable putting more weighting against them.
So you probably already answered the next question, Blair, about how do you evaluate which metrics are best for you? It seems the ones that are best tied to the company strategy to move that forward, but what do you say?
You want it tied to the strategy. You want to be able to objectively measure it. You want it to be somewhat consistent over time. You want to be able to show the impact to shareholders, which means you need to be able to be comfortable if you miss it, talking to shareholders and other stakeholders about it. And I think, that last one is not to be underestimated, right? Because everybody wants to be a winner right now, particularly in diversity and inclusion metrics. And if we're going to make these real, they're going to have to be like any other metric where sometimes you beat it and sometimes you miss it. And companies are going to have to get comfortable with that conversation as well.
And then, Mike, how about tweaking your metrics over time? How do you evaluate if they're working as intended?
Yeah, I think, again, there's going to be this natural evolution of maybe looking at inputs, then moving to more measured metrics and then adding more weight. But, along the way, evaluating if you're getting a change in behavior, people understand the metric, people feel like they can influence the metric, do they feel that the outcomes are fair? So some of this will be iterative with the participants. It'll also be something that I think shareholders will want to weigh in on, especially in terms of how the company's rating itself versus how shareholders might feel. So I think there'll be opportunities to get input as you go along. That's why it's probably good to start slow and kind of build your way into this. So, getting more weighting, putting on more measured metrics versus qualitative metrics, but it's going to be iterative, Brock. And I think, again, does it resonate with people? Does it resonate with investors? Are we making a difference? And safety is a very good example of that. I mean, we have clients that, set safety goals, and then there's a lot of industry safety data, so then they could do relative safety comparisons. And then, it became, ingrained in the culture. It became much easier to measure, and there was no question how important safety was. And it was easier to add more weight to it. So I see this as a similar journey, in a broader framework of ESG. Same with net promoter scores. They're smiling, the dogs are barking. In retail, just customer satisfaction, and they've gotten so much more sophisticated in evaluating the shopper experience. And so it makes it easier to put weight on it. It's easier to demonstrate to employees how they can actually influence it by store, by region, by the types of behavior changes that occur in a store.
So Blair, this disclosure is not just a proxy thing. There's E&S reports, there's employee communications. How do these ESG metrics for pay find themselves into those other methods of disclosure, or do they?
So it feels like a missed opportunity if you don't integrate the two. I mean, if you're using those reports, whether it's your CSR report or your website, to communicate what's important to you, it puts an extra underscore about the importance if you say you've linked it to your compensation program. The other place that I've seen, not just ESG metrics, but other metrics used to great effect is when the CEO does the investor day and they talk about these are our metrics, and you can directly see them in our compensation program. And I think that's another opportunity from an external standpoint to emphasize that these metrics are important, you're committed to it. In fact, you're putting your money where your mouth is.
And I've seen some companies now start to disclose in the CDNA, how we evaluate overall company performance. So even though it's not in our metrics, they talk about a whole host of things that are looked at. They refer to the CSR report. They might even bring in some of the data into the CDNA because, there's maybe different readers between the 10K and the CSR report and the proxy. And so this way you cover all your bases, hit all your major audiences.
There's no question. And some things are going to be more accessible than others to individuals. You just want to make sure you're consistent across all of those. But really, it does show a true commitment when you put things in compensation, given the limited real estate that you have.
Well, this will be a topic that only grows in importance over time. So thank you so much for your expertise. And it's great to see you again, Blair and Mike.
Yes, great to see you.
Great to see you. And congratulations on your new gig.
You too.